Thank you. Thank you, Randa, for inviting us for this session and nice introduction in this morning. So very glad to be here and good morning to everyone. So after listening to Alessandro's presentation on GTU, we're going to talk about this, our new report, which is Trade Preferences Outlook, which you found a copy, their copy was outside, so maybe some of you might have taken the copy. So please, for those who haven't yet got a copy, please go and get the copies, please. So this is our report. We produce basically every 2 years, once every 2 years, but for some reason, we had another version last year, and then this is the second version we are producing this time around. So this Trade Preference Outlook is basically about trade preferences, literally. So trade preferences means unilateral preferences, like as our director mentioned this morning, General System of Trade Preferences, GSP, and many other similar schemes like DFQF, Duty-Free Quota-Free Initiative, and so on. So this is the report where we try to kind of monitor the evolution of these important trade instruments and see how, what are the implications for developing countries, because UNCTAD is the organization where in which this GSP was negotiated and created in the past. So that was in the 1960s and 70s. So UNCTAD has a very this is our legacy product, and UNCTAD keeps monitoring these important trade instruments. So in this report, which were produced in 2025 last year. Of course, we are interested in knowing the implication of trade uncertainty, which was brought by certain policy changes. And we want to see what are the implications of those uncertainty to preferential trade, which remains a very important avenue of trade for many developing countries. So in a nutshell, I think we try to assess the implication of global policy uncertainty, general uncertainty, introduced by certain policy initiatives, and also look into what has been the implication of termination of certain trade preference programs. Because we saw recently, there has been some cases where certain trade policy preference schemes have been expiring or terminated. And so this came at the same time as heightened trade policy uncertainty last year. So we wanted to see what has been the implication of this impact, whether this has a real impact on developing countries' exports or not. And so that's what we try to do in this report. So in this report, we had 3 chapters. Somehow technically divided. First chapter talks about trade preference and uncertainty, and Chapter 2 talks about the impact of preference losses, and Chapter 3 is more policy implication and concluding chapter. So in this session, I'm going to talk about Chapter 1, basically. Looking back the little bit about past and the current situation of trade preferences. And Mezu and Federico, my colleagues, will talk about more the future-oriented perspective to see what might happen in the future if certain things are happening or not happening. So my presentation will be more about the current status and a little bit of the what happened in the past. So the basic focus of my chapter session here is about what has happened in the past when trade preferences are removed for certain countries or somehow expiring or terminated. So that's my focus of my presentation. But just as a way of background, let me just explain really briefly on some basics. This is non-tariff preferences is basically removal or reduction of a tariff, which certain countries do unilaterally in favor of other countries, which is basically developing countries, and recently more focused on LDCs. So major types of preferences are basically 3. One is, as I mentioned, is GSP, which was created in UNCTAD. And more recently, there's been more efforts to provide duty-free, quota-free market access for LDC. That was basically, there was a movement in WTO to grant these schemes, and that materialized somehow around 2005. And then many countries have started to implement this special preference program for LDCs, including some developing countries like China or India and some other countries. And then on top of that, we have certain preference programs which are more focused on regionally, certain regional-focused special preference program like AGOA or CBI, which is Caribbean Basin Initiative provided by US. So those are the preferences focused only for certain group of countries. And so this graph shows a very typical way of looking at different tariff levels. So if you have MFN tariff of 10%, you can have a little bit reduced tariff of, let's say, 7% under the GSP, which is more granted to normal developing countries, normal meaning not LDCs. And then for LDC, basically, there's been tendency to provide complete duty-free access, which is 100% tariff cuts as compared to MFN rates. So this kind of hierarchy of preferences are the kind of, in a nutshell, the main structure of existing trade preference programs. So just looking back a little bit to the history, as I mentioned, GSP was created in UNCTAD in 1968. There was a resolution which called for creating this type of instruments. At that time, it was called preferential or free entry or exports of manufacturers and semi-manufacturers of developing countries to the developed countries. So there was clear focus on manufacturing products because the main idea was to promote industrialization of developing countries. And then, so therefore, the objective was to increase export earnings and, of course, promote industrialization and thereby promoting economic growth. But at that time, there was also very the clarification was made, which says that these initiatives are voluntary undertaking on the part of developed countries to grant this preference. So this is the understanding was this is not binding commitment on the part of developed countries. So it's their kind of the unilateral undertaking, and therefore and also temporary. So this is not meant to be permanent, although this scheme has luckily or some reason continued to exist until today. So this is the preference is little bit against MFN principle because you are providing privilege to a certain group of countries, but this is covered under the enabling clause, so it's WTO compatible. So just to reflect a little bit on why this instrument was created at that time. So we found it was a little bit a kind of policy response to the development challenge of the time because there was a very significant development challenges at the time, 1960s, 70s, immediately after the World War II. And many countries were commodity dependent, which remains the case today, but it's more significant. Some 70% of developing countries' exports were in primary commodities. And at that time, there was a huge north-south gap difference. So developed countries' market accounted for some 70% of developing countries' exports. It was a huge market at the time as compared to today. And also MFN tariff, as Alessandro mentioned, this WTO and GATT trade negotiation happened, was not so active at the time, 1960s and 70s. The most significant round was the Uruguay round, which was in 1980s. So this was kind of prior to WTO negotiations. And also many countries were wishing to realize industrialization while protecting its own market. So the idea behind was, I think, more to import substitution, because you are not required to open your market, but you are trying to get more better market access in large and growing developed country markets. So that was the rationale. But I think over the 60 years, because now 68 and now today it's 26, there has been a lot of changes in the world economy, and then situation and the pattern of trade has changed. So not today, commodity dependence remains for many countries as a challenge. But the developed countries not such a big market, and now more emerging market, developing countries becoming more important market for other developing countries. And also, as Alessandro mentioned, the MFN tariff has declined over the years, thanks to WTO negotiations and unilateral initiatives. And also, lots of regional trade agreements were established during this period. So therefore, the overall tariff level has declined. So that means the scope for providing tariff preference has become narrow. So there is less possibility to provide tariff preferences. And also there has been growth in global value chains. So that means in that process, you need to import a lot of inputs in order to be able to export manufactured goods. So import substitution as such doesn't work very well in the current trade structure. So there's a lot of changes in situation which makes unilateral trade preference not as effective as we would have wished. But still, this remains important instruments for developing countries, especially for LDC. So let me just show this current situation. It's a global picture of trade in preferential schemes. So my colleague did this calculation sometime last year, looking at 25 markets, because there are 25 markets which provide certain form of trade preferences. And we looked at all the imports from eligible, the countries which are eligible for those schemes. So the overall, we had something like 1.3 trillion imports into those markets. This is total imports, and out of which some 50% are MFN duty-free. So that means preference is not relevant because, in order to be able to provide preference, you need to have positive MFN duty. So 50% MFN duty-free, and then the rest of 50% not duty-free. So that's where preference comes in. And out of this amount, we found some 62% were eligible for certain preference. So this means coverage. So in the preferential trade, we talk about coverage rate and utilization rates. So this somehow 62% is kind of, we can consider as a coverage rate of the global trade. Globally speaking, the average coverage rates for the preference programs. And then out of this amount, some 42% were actually the provided preferential tariffs. So importers claimed actually these preferential tariffs in order to be able to export at a lower tariff level. So this 42% is kind of more the global average of utilization rates, what is called utilization rates. So we can see this magnitude of the different trade conducted within and outside the preference program. So at the end of the day, you only have a very small portion of imports actually using preferences as compared to the original total amount of 1.3 trillion. So you may find this is very little, but for this amount still counts for a number of countries, and that's where, especially for LDC, so that's where a lot of policy, we need to look into this portion of the schemes. So let me just talk a bit of the recent trends in this preference trade flows. So we just looked at the current situation of the overall trade amount. But over the past decade or so, there has been some initiative and trends. And one and most important trends we see is the increasing focus on LDC. So first of all, there has been, as I mentioned, there's the bigger efforts to provide duty-free, quota-free access for all LDCs for almost all products. So that is one. And then secondly, we have seen very significant improvements in the rules for origin over the past decades. And so here we are looking at the example of EU in terms of rules of origin of apparel products, where when EU introduced what is called the single transformation route, which is a kind of more flexible rules of origin, which allows you to use imported fabric to export clothing. So just you can do the one stage of transformation. So that qualify already EU rules of origin. So EU made these changes, and we see the utilization of that particular product went up very significantly. So this is one instrument whereby countries to try to facilitate export of LDCs. Alessandro mentioned this. Nowadays, there's the opposite movement of making rules more restrictive under certain regional trade agreement, given the current context. But here, in the context of preferential rules of origin under unilateral programs, there has been this effort to facilitate LDC exports to those markets. And secondly, this is this may be seen as good or bad, but there's been increased focus on limiting the eligibility to only for LDCs. So in the case of EU, for instance, they excluded or take out of those countries out of list of eligible countries. So those countries are upper middle income countries. So now EU GSP scheme excludes some of those big countries. So now more and more focusing on LDCs and the more vulnerable countries. And then, so as a result of those efforts, actually the major users of preferences has become very much LDCs nowadays, because under the unilateral program like a GSP, many middle-income countries are graduated or not anymore benefiting that program, and also those middle-income countries are more and more having the other FTAs whereby they can use also exports to the, for instance, EU under the preferential terms. Therefore, here we are looking at 4 markets, EU, Canada, Japan, and US, and then except the US, in all markets, the LDCs are, in terms of value, today is those are the export most, the highest value of trade under the preferential terms. So that has been the situation up until now. So let me just briefly talk about this, what happened if the existing trade preferences program are terminated, or that happened in the US. As we know, the US general system of preferences, GSP, expired in 2000, and it's not updated, activated since then. So together with GSP, the special preference for LDCs, this is also remains terminated. And then on top of that, we had an issue of AGOA, which expired last year, 2005, September. And then luckily this scheme was temporarily updated up until end of this year, but this remains temporarily. So in 2025, so we had a situation where most of the US trade preference program was terminated, or so for exporters, they lost these preferences. So what would be the implication of this termination of the programs? So we are looking at here the possible impact of those preference losses for exporters. So in the case of the US, here, this graph compares the coverage rate and utilization rate we looked at of different schemes, GSP, LDC, and AGOA. So we see here the AGOA clearly is the kind of the most significant program as compared to GSP and GSP for LDCs in terms of coverage rate and utilization rate. So that means those preference program covers number of products, and also those preferences are actually used by exporters or importers. So this is the difference. So AGOA is more used than normal GSP. That's my observation. And then there's a difference in terms of the pattern of imports provided by coming under the GSP and AGOA. So GSP, in the case of the US, is utilized more middle-income countries, by middle-income countries, countries like Indonesia or Thailand, Brazil, and those are the major exporters under this program. And they exporting significant amount of trade under this program, but preferential segment, the trade actually using preference are relatively small. They have other part of trade which comes into under the and outside of the preference program, or those products which failed to use actually the program. So in terms of the amount, those middle-income countries are the major user of the US GSP, but there are a lot of amount those countries which doesn't fall under the GSP program. So that's one observation. So as compared to that, in the case of AGOA, here the major exporters are countries like Nigeria and South Africa and Kenya and others. So those countries are here. Their exports are actually coming under the preference program. So they are most of their products are traded covered, and then they are actually using those preferences. So this is because AGOA has a very broad product coverage, and also the tariff margin is significant, and rules of origins are somehow more easier to use for some group of countries. That's why the AGOA has a significant impact on sub-Saharan countries' exports. And if we look at some of the smaller countries which qualify for apparel benefits, because AGOA has certain benefits for some subgroup of AGOA beneficiaries, whereby they can export apparel products using very flexible rules of origin, which is similar to the rule we just saw in the case of the EU, allowing the country to use the imported fabric to be able to export final apparel products. So using these schemes, countries like Lesotho and Kenya and Tanzania and others, they managed to use a significant amount of apparel products to the US using this program. And as a result of that, I mean, they are benefited from significant amount of tariff savings. We calculate a certain amount, but the point is Lesotho is very much benefiting this program. This tariff savings they are getting out of this AGOA preference is like almost 20% of their total exports to the US. So that is very significant benefits they are benefiting from. So therefore, when GSP has already expired and AGOA was not extended last year, there was a lot of concern, and there still remains concerns of that the concern I think had happened, that those countries which benefited significantly from the AGOA preference would be significantly impacted in terms of lost exports and also the production and jobs, because those are the quite labor-intensive sectors. So that's the kind of I think the observation we can make out of this static picture. And so AGOA, we are expecting a significant impact, but we couldn't analyze the data because that was so contemporary. I mean, 2025 we didn't have data to monitor AGOA products. So, but we checked the impact of a GSP expiration, which took place in 2020. And if we compare the before and after the expiration of GSP, there was clear decline in preferential imports coming into US under GSP as compared to other programs like AGOA or CBI, because at that time, the situation is that AGOA and CBI were still in place, whereas GSP has expired. So therefore, the one conclusion we are making is this preference program has had a very significant or meaningful impact for those exporters which are actually benefiting from those programs. I mean, the better you use those programs, the more likely that you are to be affected by termination of trade preference program. So this is one kind of case study we did in this report. Very briefly, we also looked at some of the cases where the example of the preference termination, which is the situation where some preference-giving countries has the flexibility to terminate certain preferences to some countries, specific countries, on different non-economic reasons, like labor issues or human rights conditions or many others. So on that ground, there are several cases where some countries were excluded from preference programs. So we saw the case of Bangladesh from the US GSP schemes in 2013, and Cambodia was partially suspended from the EU in 2020 for human rights reasons, and Ethiopia also from AGOA, taken out of the AGOA eligibility in 2022 for similar reasons. So those are the cases where preference stopped at one point in time, suddenly at one point in time, and we checked the the relationship between their situation under the preference program and their trade impact. So we looked at situation. So in the case of Cambodia and Ethiopia, so they were clearly the countries which were benefiting significantly from those schemes. So in the case of Cambodia, they were benefiting from EBA quite significantly. And also Ethiopia was also the major user of US AGOA scheme. But by contrast, Bangladesh was not much benefiting from US GSP because US GSP scheme excludes textile and apparel products for so therefore Bangladesh were not actually using US GSP scheme that much. So that's the situation before the exclusion. And then after the exclusion, we observed that actually their bilateral exports to EU or US, the case may be, went down very significantly after the exclusion of those countries because of the loss of preferences. For Bangladesh, there was there was quite significant decline in preference export, but that's a bit. We know that was a bit more different reasons, because Bangladesh was not anyway benefiting from preferences, but it was more kind of reputational ground. But in the case of Cambodia and Ethiopia, we clearly saw their export declined, and they were not able to continue to export to those markets, but redirecting their exports to the other markets. So that was the conclusion of this specific cases of preference erosion. So therefore, just let me conclude by just saying, trade preference was an important instrument for developing countries, but their impact has declined over the years. But still, that remains important instruments for some group of countries, like especially LDCs. So, and the current trade policy uncertainty and lack of preferential access has had a meaningful impact depending on the situation. So our conclusion is the more benefiting you are from preference program, the more likely that you are affected by exclusion or termination of this preference program. So that's the kind of immediate, how shall I say, the intermediate conclusion which I leave with this chapter 1 of the report, and maybe other colleagues will explain further to the different scenarios. But let me stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.